Ever walk into a room and instantly feel the vibe? Like you just know if people are tense or excited or maybe even a little suspicious of you.
Mm.
That's your brain making lightning fast judgments. And today we're diving deep into that, the fascinating world of snap judgments.
Yeah.
We'll unpack the science behind these split-second assessments,
Right.
explore how evolution and even cavemen play a role,
Uh-huh.
and examine the impact these judgments have on our lives,
Okay.
from job interviews to first dates, and even those quick glances at online profiles.
It's incredible how much information our brains process in just a fraction of a second.
Wow.
We're talking about judging attractiveness,
Uh-huh.
trustworthiness, competence, even someone's personality,
Wow.
all before we've even consciously registered their face.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Sure.
It's almost like our brains are working on autopilot,
Yeah.
making these assessments without us even realizing it.
Right.
But there's got to be a reason for it, right?
Yeah.
It can't just be random.
You're right. It's not random at all. In fact, these snap judgments are rooted in our evolutionary past.
Right.
Think back to our early human ancestors.
Okay.
Their survival depended on quickly assessing whether someone was a friend or foe, a potential threat or a potential mate.
So I'm picturing a caveman spotting someone across a clearing.
Mm-hmm.
They're not exactly taking the time to have a deep conversation, right?
No.
They need to know instantly if this person is dangerous or not.
Exactly. And to make those split-second decisions, they relied on visual cues.
Right.
Things like facial symmetry, posture, and even how energetic someone seemed. These cues might have signaled good health and strong genes, which were crucial for survival
Yeah.
and passing on those genes to the next generation.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
So even though we're not living in caves anymore, those ancient instincts are still wired into our brains,
Right.
influencing how we perceive people today.
Yes.
But how does this actually work on a neurological level? Are there specific parts of our brains dedicated to making these judgments?
Absolutely. Two key players here are the amygdala and the fusiform gyrus.
Okay.
The amygdala is our brain's emotional center,
Okay.
constantly scanning for potential threats and triggering our fight or flight response.
So that explains why we might feel a sudden surge of anxiety or fear
Yeah.
when we encounter someone who seems intimidating or untrustworthy.
Right.
It's our amygdala kicking into gear.
Precisely. And then we have the fusiform gyrus,
Wow.
which is like our brain's facial recognition software.
Oh.
It helps us quickly categorize faces
Right.
and process social categories like age, gender, and even race.
It's fascinating how our brains are making these complex calculations in milliseconds,
Right.
categorizing people and assessing potential threats all before we've even had a chance to say hello.
Yeah.
But this categorization process can also be a bit problematic, right?
Yes.
It can lead to stereotypes and biases.
That's a crucial point.
Okay.
While these rapid categorizations can be helpful in some situations,
Right.
they can also lead to inaccurate and unfair judgments.
Yeah.
We have to remember that these categories are often overly simplistic
Okay.
and don't capture the full complexity of an individual.
So it's like our brains are taking a shortcut,
Right.
using readily available information to make quick decisions.
Uh-huh.
But sometimes those shortcuts lead us down the wrong path.
You've hit the nail on the head. We call these mental shortcuts heuristics.
Heuristics.
Yeah, they allow us to navigate the social world efficiently, but they can also lead to biases and errors in judgment.
Can you give us an example of how this might play out in a real-world situation?
Imagine you're scrolling through online dating profiles.
Okay.
You might quickly swipe left or right based on a photo and a few lines of text.
Okay.
You're using heuristics, those mental shortcuts, to make a snap judgment about whether you find someone attractive or interesting.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
We're bombarded with so much information these days that our brains have to find ways to simplify things and make quick decisions. But how accurate are these snap judgments, really? Are they reliable indicators of a person's true character or behavior?
That's the million-dollar question.
Oh, yeah.
While research suggests there's some degree of consistency in how people form first impressions, we tend to agree on things like who looks approachable or competent.
Right.
The link between those snap judgments and a person's actual behavior is more complex.
So just because we all agree someone seems trustworthy doesn't necessarily mean they are.
Exactly. Think of it like judging a book by its cover.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes you get lucky and the cover reflects the story inside, but other times it's completely misleading.
That's a great analogy. And it really highlights the potential dangers of relying too heavily on those initial impressions. We've got studies showing how snap judgments can influence everything from hiring decisions to jury verdicts, even the outcome of elections.
It's true. These split-second judgments can have a ripple effect, shaping our interactions and, in some cases, perpetuating biases and stereotypes even if we're not consciously aware of them.
It's a bit unsettling to think about, isn't it? That these unconscious biases could be influencing such important decisions. But it's not just about those face-to-face encounters, right? Our sources also talked about the influence of media and societal norms.
Absolutely. Think about the images we're constantly bombarded with in magazines, movies, social media.
Yeah.
They create a narrow and often unrealistic standard of beauty, success, and even trustworthiness.
So we're not just born with these ideas about what's desirable. They're shaped by the world around us.
Yeah.
And that can lead to some pretty harmful comparisons and self-doubt.
It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
We internalize these idealized images and then use them as a yardstick to judge both ourselves and others, often leading to feelings of inadequacy or even prejudice.
It sounds like we're caught in a web of snap judgments, influenced by our evolutionary past, shaped by societal pressures, and often operating beneath our conscious awareness.
Right.
It's a lot to untangle. But is there anything we can do about it? Are we just hardwired to make these quick judgments?
The good news is our brains are remarkably adaptable.
Okay, good.
The research mentions simple interventions like computer training programs
Okay.
that expose people to a diverse range of faces and challenge stereotypical associations, have been shown to reduce implicit bias.
So it's not a hopeless situation. We can actually train our brains to be more aware and less reliant on those ingrained biases.
Precisely. The first step is awareness. Once we understand how these unconscious processes work, we can start to question our own assumptions and look beyond those initial impressions.
That makes sense. But it's also important to remember that not all snap judgments are bad, right?
Of course.
There are times when those quick assessments can actually be helpful.
Of course.
Okay. In many situations, they allow us to quickly assess potential danger or make efficient decisions in complex environments. Think about a doctor in an emergency room.
Right.
They need to rapidly assess a patient's condition to make life-saving decisions. The key is finding a balance. Using those instincts when needed, but also being aware of their limitations.
Yeah.
So it's about being mindful and not letting those snap judgments completely dictate our actions or how we treat others. Speaking of limitations, we've got some fascinating research on how our brains handle multiracial faces and the role of controllable features in shaping first impressions.
The research on multiracial faces is particularly interesting.
Yeah.
Studies using fMRI have shown that when presented with multiracial faces, our brains take a bit longer to categorize them, showing increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, the area associated with cognitive control.
So it's like our brains are encountering something novel and having to work a bit harder to process it. But why is that?
It could be because multiracial faces challenge those pre-existing racial categories we've learned, requiring our brains to override those initial impulses and engage in more deliberate processing.
That's fascinating. And the research even suggests that exposure to diversity actually plays a role in how easily we perceive and trust multiracial faces. The more diverse our experiences, the more adaptable our brains become.
Exactly. It's like building mental agility. The more diverse faces and cultures we encounter, the less likely we are to rely on those rigid, oversimplified categories.
That's a powerful argument for seeking out diverse perspectives and experiences.
Yeah.
It literally rewires our brains to be more inclusive and less reliant on snap judgments.
It really does. And speaking of rewiring, let's touch on those controllable features. Some aspects of our appearance, like our facial expressions, are more under our control than others, like the shape of our face.
So I can't exactly change my bone structure overnight, but I can learn to smile more, which might make me seem more approachable or trustworthy.
You got it. The research suggests that even subtle changes in our facial expressions can influence how others perceive us.
Interesting.
For instance, studies have shown that simply turning up the corners of your lips and relaxing your brow can increase perceptions of trustworthiness.
It's kind of empowering to know that we have some agency in how we present ourselves, even if we can't control every aspect of our appearance. But does that mean we should all be walking around with forced smiles plastered on our faces? Isn't there a risk of coming across as inauthentic?
That's a valid point. It's not about masking our true emotions or conforming to some artificial standard. It's more about being mindful of how our expressions might be interpreted and using them intentionally to communicate our desired message.
So it's about finding a balance being aware of how our expressions might influence others' perceptions while also remaining true to ourselves. I like that. It's about taking ownership of our nonverbal communication, which is a fascinating aspect of this whole snap judgment phenomenon.
It is. And it highlights the complex interplay between our biology, our culture, and our own conscious choices in shaping how we perceive and interact with the world around us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. From the evolutionary roots of snap judgments to the brain regions involved, the role of heuristics, and the influence of media and societal norms. We've also talked about the potential consequences of these judgments and some strategies for mitigating bias. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, finding that balance between acknowledging the reality of snap judgments and minimizing their negative impact.
It's a crucial point. We can't simply turn off these rapid assessments, nor would we want to.
Right.
They serve an important purpose in helping us navigate the complexities of social life.
Of course.
But we can become more aware of how they operate, challenge our assumptions, and strive to make more informed and equitable decisions.
So it's about acknowledging those initial impressions, but not letting them be the final word.
Right.
It's about pausing, reflecting, and seeking out more information before forming a judgment.
Precisely. And that pause, that moment of reflection, is where we can start to disrupt those automatic processes and make more conscious, thoughtful choices.
I think that's a powerful takeaway for our listeners. But before we let you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts on a question that's been swirling in my mind throughout this entire discussion. If snap judgments are so deeply ingrained in how our brains work, how can we as individuals and as a society work to minimize the negative impacts of bias while still acknowledging the role these assessments play in our daily lives? It seems like a real dilemma.
It is a dilemma, isn't it? And there's no easy answer. But I think the key lies in a combination of awareness, education, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
Can you elaborate on that a bit more? What would
Yeah.
that look like in practice?
Certainly. First and foremost, we need to educate ourselves about how implicit bias works.
Okay.
The more we understand the unconscious processes at play, the better equipped we'll be to recognize and challenge our own biases.
That's where resources like this deep dive come in,
All right.
helping people understand the science behind these judgments.
Exactly. We can also be more mindful of the context in which snap judgments are most likely to lead to unfair outcomes.
Right.
For example, when evaluating job candidates or making decisions that impact someone's access to opportunities.
So slowing down, asking more questions, and really trying to see beyond those initial impressions.
Precisely. And in situations where it's not possible to completely eliminate the influence of snap judgments, we can try to implement safeguards that help mitigate their impact.
Like using structured interview formats, focusing on objective criteria, and having diverse decision-making teams.
Exactly. These are just a few examples, but the key is to be proactive and intentional about addressing the potential for bias. It's an ongoing process, not a one-time fix.
It's a lot to consider, but clearly an incredibly important topic with far-reaching implications. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of snap judgments, what's the one takeaway you hope our listener walks away with today?
I'd say the most important takeaway is simply this. Awareness is key. The next time you meet someone new, pause and consider those intricate unconscious processes happening in your brain. Challenge those initial assumptions, dig a little deeper, and remember that first impressions, while powerful, don't always tell the whole story.
It's like we're reminding ourselves to hit the mental pause button, to be more mindful and deliberate in how we form judgments, especially when those judgments can have real-world consequences for others.
Precisely. By cultivating that awareness, we can start to make more informed, equitable decisions and treat each other with greater fairness and understanding.
Beautifully put. And on that note, I think we've given our listener plenty to ponder today. But as always, we'd like to leave you with a final provocative thought to keep those mental gears turning.
If snap judgments are so ingrained in how our brains work, how can we as individuals and as a society work to minimize the negative impacts of bias while still acknowledging the role these assessments play in our daily lives? It's a complex challenge, but one worth grappling with.
Absolutely. It's a challenge that requires ongoing reflection, education, and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable world. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.